This is the story of 15 Sith Lords, ranked from the ones the galaxy correctly identified as minor threats, to the one being that the galaxy never had a name terrifying enough for. And the thread connecting all 15 is the same. Almost every one of them was underestimated for the exact reason that later made them unstoppable. We start at the bottom. We end somewhere the word Lord stops being big enough. How a 2,000-year bloodline of murderers, prodigies and monsters produces at its absolute peak something that isn't really a person anymore, that starts with understanding what the weakest Sith on this list got wrong and what the strongest one got right before anyone else even knew there was a lesson to learn. Before you drift off completely, if these stories help you rest, consider subscribing here on YouTube and follow us on Spotify for a screen-free way to fall asleep tomorrow night. Sleep well, and see you in the next story. Number 15. Darth Talon. A Twi'lek assassin walks into a cantina on Coruscant 100 years after the Empire has fallen, and every bounty hunter in the room goes quiet. Not because they recognize her face, because they recognize the tattoos. Darth Talon is, by the numbers, the weakest Sith Lord on this list, and that is not an insult, it is the whole point of starting here. Talon was raised inside the One Sith, the reconstituted Sith Order built by Darth Krayt roughly 100 years after the fall of Sidious's empire. She never knew a galaxy where the Sith ruled openly. She was born into an organization already rebuilding itself from ash, which meant every lesson she learned was a lesson in scarcity. According to the Star Wars Legacy comic series, Talon rose through Krayt's ranks not through political maneuvering. She had none of Sidious's patience or Dooku's aristocratic connections, but through raw physical excellence, honed obsessively because it was the only currency she had. This is her defining trait, and it will recur 3 times before this entry ends. Talon had nothing except her body, so her body became a weapon precise enough to make nothing else irrelevant. It helps to understand what nothing else actually meant for someone raised inside Krayt's order. The One Sith, in its early decades, was not a court full of ancient holocrons and inherited fortunes the way Sidious's empire or the ancient Sith pureblood civilization had been. It was a hunted, hidden organization rebuilding itself in the ruins of a galaxy that had already survived one apocalyptic Sith regime and had no patience left for another. Talon came up inside a culture of Sith who trained the way soldiers train in a war they cannot afford to lose. Brutal repetition, minimal ceremony, results over pedigree. She was noticed early, according to the Legacy comics, precisely because she treated every training exercise as if failure meant death, which inside Krayt's order it frequently did. Her body became not just a tool but an argument, proof that the Sith could still produce warriors capable of standing toe-to-toe with a galaxy that had by that point forgotten how dangerous the old Empire really was. Her signature duel, the one that defines her reputation across every ranking, every forum argument, every who would win debate, is her fight against Cade Skywalker, a descendant of the Skywalker line who had, by that point in the timeline, mostly abandoned the Jedi Order for a life of piracy and bounty hunting. Cade was untrained by Jedi standards but naturally gifted, undisciplined, furious. Talon fought him not with overwhelming force power, but with acrobatics precise enough to look choreographed, strikes that never wasted momentum. She did not win that fight through the Force. She won rounds of it through pure physical mastery, the kind of martial skill that doesn't require decades of Sith apprenticeship, just brutal, repeated, obsessive practice. This is important, because it tells you exactly what tier she occupies. Talon is proof that the weakest end of the Sith spectrum is still terrifyingly competent by any normal standard. She is not weak. She is simply outclassed by everyone else on this list. Their history together is longer and stranger than a single duel suggests. According to the Legacy series, Talon and Cade crossed paths repeatedly across the storyline, sometimes as enemies, sometimes in uneasy, temporary alliance against threats that made their own rivalry look small by comparison. That recurring dynamic matters, because it shows something rankings built purely around who beat whom in a fight tend to miss. Talon was never simply a hurdle for Cade to clear on his way to some larger destiny. She was a genuine, sustained threat that shaped the choices he made across years of in-universe time, precisely because she never stopped being dangerous, even after losing ground to him in any single encounter. It would be easy to read Talon's placement here as a demotion. It is not. It is a baseline. Every Sith Lord ranked above her, all the way up to the entity at the top of this list, has to be understood as more dangerous than a woman who can casually outfight a Skywalker in melee combat. That is the floor of this list. Keep that number in your head. It will matter later, when the gap between the top and bottom of this ranking stops looking like a spectrum and starts looking like a different category of being entirely. Talon's value to Darth Krayt was never purely combat. She also served as one of his most trusted enforcers during the internal purges that followed Krayt's takeover of the reconstituted Sith Order, hunting down members who wavered in loyalty or who represented rival power bases within the One Sith hierarchy. This is a detail rankings tend to skip because it isn't flashy, but it matters. An order rebuilding itself from a single surviving philosophy needs internal police as much as it needs external conquerors, and Talon filled that role without complaint, without ambition of her own, and without ever once trying to unseat the master she served. Consider what that enforcer role actually required of her, psychologically as much as physically. Purging your own order means hunting people you trained alongside, people who may have taught you techniques you still use, people whose only crime was hesitation rather than outright betrayal. Most Sith Lords on this list who were asked to do that kind of work eventually turned it into personal ambition, a chance to eliminate rivals, to climb over the bodies of people they'd removed. Talon, according to the legacy material, never did. She treated the purges as maintenance, not opportunity. That distinction is subtle, but it is the entire reason she ranks where she does. She had every chance any ambitious lieutenant gets to turn loyalty into leverage, and she simply never took it. That loyalty is itself a data point. Every Sith Lord ranked above her on this list eventually turned on a master, a subordinate, or both. Talon never did. She is, in a strange way, the most stable Sith Lord on this entire list, and stability, in the Sith Order, is usually a symptom of limited ambition rather than limited danger. Her final act, chronicled in the concluding arcs of Star Wars, Legacy, comes after Krayt's death and the One Sith's collapse into civil war. Talon does not seize the throne herself. She does not have the political appetite for it. Instead, she becomes something closer to a kingmaker, aligning herself with whichever successor she judges most capable of holding the Order together. A decision that, again, prioritizes the survival of the institution over her own personal advancement. It was not ambition that limited Talon's ceiling. It was the absence of ambition entirely. The same quality that made her the most loyal and dependable Sith on this list also made her the least likely to ever climb higher than Lieutenant. She proves the floor of Sith power is still lethal. She also proves that the floor and the ceiling on this list are separated by something more than raw skill. They're separated by hunger. But raw physical mastery has a ceiling, and the next Sith Lord on this list proves it, because he had every physical gift Talon had, and something else entirely that should have made him unbeatable, and it still wasn't enough. Number 14. Darth Maul. At last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have revenge. A dismissed apprentice's master says that sentence, and the galaxy spends the next 30 years assuming the apprentice was the least interesting part of that plan. Darth Maul was supposed to be a footnote, a single appearance enforcer cut down in a duel that lasted less than 2 minutes, remembered mostly for a double-bladed lightsaber and a face full of Night Brother tattoos. That was the plan. It did not work. Maul was trained from early childhood by Darth Sidious specifically to be discarded. According to Star Wars Darth Maul, son of Dathomir and the character's expanded appearances across the Clone Wars, Sidious selected Maul not primarily for his potential as a future Sith Master, but for his obedience, a weapon with no independent will, meant to execute one mission and then, implicitly, be replaced. Maul was never groomed as an heir. He was groomed as a knife. The training itself deserves more attention than most summaries give it. Maul was taken from Dathomir as a child and raised in near-total isolation, subjected to a regimen designed less to cultivate wisdom or strategic thinking than to strip away everything except reflex, obedience, and rage. Where Sidious would later mentor Dooku through years of political philosophy, and, later still, Anakin through carefully engineered emotional manipulation, Maul received almost none of that intellectual investment. He was drilled in combat until his body stopped distinguishing between training and survival. This is the detail worth sitting with before anything else in his story. Sidious built himself an instrument so single-purposed that its eventual escape from that purpose reads, in hindsight, almost like a design flaw rather than a triumph of will. Maul had to become more than his training to survive what came after Naboo, and the training itself had done everything possible to make sure he never would. He did not know that. He believed for years that his devotion would be rewarded with what every Sith apprentice wants: elevation. It was not true. When Obi-Wan Kenobi cut him in half on Naboo, Sidious did not mourn him or plan a rescue. He moved on to Dooku within the year. Maul was, by every measure his master used, already obsolete. What happened next is the entire reason Maul ranks above Talon despite losing his signature duel. He survived. Bisected, discarded, driven half-mad by rage and phantom pain, he clawed his way back into relevance across a decade of Clone Wars and Rebel storylines, reconstructing a body from junk and dark-side fury on Lotho Minor, hunting down Obi-Wan for personal vengeance rather than any master's orders, and eventually conquering Mandalore itself with Death Watch as his army. That is not the resume of a discarded tool. That is the resume of someone who refused the role he was assigned. The years on Lotho Minor deserve their own accounting because they are the single strangest survival story on this entire list. According to material covering that period, Maul existed there not as a functioning Sith Lord plotting his return, but as something closer to a feral animal. Half a torso, driven by hatred alone, scuttling through garbage on spider-like mechanical legs he'd scavenged and fused to his own body through sheer dark side will. He had no plan. He had no resources. He had, according to the storytelling built around this era, effectively lost his mind, reduced to an existence defined entirely by pain and fury, with almost nothing recognizable left of the disciplined assassin who'd once knelt before Sidious. That total psychological collapse is what makes his eventual recovery so significant. Most beings, reduced that far, simply stay broken. Maul did not. There's a scene, referenced across multiple sourcebooks covering the character's Mandalorian campaign, where Maul, now ruling an entire warrior culture through Death Watch, is asked why he bothers with politics when his only real goal was always revenge on Obi-Wan. His answer, paraphrased across his portrayal in that era, power was never really about revenge. Revenge was the excuse. Power itself had become the addiction. Before Naboo, before the bisection that was supposed to end him, Maul was already proving something about himself that Sidious chose not to notice. According to Star Wars, Darth Maul, son of Dathomir, Maul's own mother, Mother Talzin, was a powerful Night Sister witch who maintained a hidden connection to her son even after Sidious took him for training. A connection Sidious never fully severed and never fully controlled. That gap in Sidious's control is what allowed Maul, decades later, to be resurrected through Talzin's magic, rather than simply rotting away on Lotho Minor as intended. Talzin's own role in this story is worth expanding, because it recontextualizes Maul's entire arc as something closer to a proxy war between two dark side traditions, rather than a simple tale of a fallen apprentice. The Night Sisters of Dathomir practiced a form of dark side sorcery, distinct from, and, in some ways, older than the Sith tradition Sidious represented, rooted in ritual, clan loyalty, and a magic that treated the Force as something closer to a living, biddable spirit than the cold instrument of Will Sidious's Sith philosophy taught. When Talzin reached across the galaxy to reconstitute her son's shattered mind and restore his sanity, she was not simply performing an act of maternal devotion. According to Son of Dathomir, she was attempting to reclaim a weapon Sidious had stolen from her people, positioning Maul's recovery as the opening move in a conflict between Night Sister sorcery and Sith discipline that predates Sidious's own rise and would outlast Maul's involvement in it. The specific tactical detail worth noting: when Talzin's agents recovered Maul, he had survived over a decade on a junk planet with nothing but spider-legged prosthetics and unrelenting hatred keeping his body functional. That is not the profile of a weapon. That is the profile of something that refuses the category weapon altogether. His war for Mandalore is the clearest proof of what Maul became once Sidious stopped watching him closely. He did not simply conquer the planet through force. He manipulated Death Watch's leader, Pre Vizsla, into a duel, killed him, and took command of an entire warrior culture through the same rite of combat traditions the Mandalorians themselves respected. Meaning Maul's rule was, by Mandalorian law, legitimate rather than imposed. He did not need Sidious's blessing, Sidious's resources, or Sidious's permission. He built a criminal political empire, the Shadow Collective, that briefly rivaled the early Empire's own reach across the Outer Rim. The Shadow Collective itself is worth a closer look because it demonstrates a political sophistication rankings rarely credit Maul with. It was not simply a criminal gang under a fiercer name. According to the era's storytelling, Maul stitched together Death Watch's warriors, Black Sun's criminal networks, and the Hutt cartel's smuggling infrastructure into a single, functioning shadow government spanning multiple sectors of the Outer Rim, a genuine rival power structure to the fledgling Empire, built entirely without Sidious's help, and, for a time, entirely without Sidious's knowledge. When Sidious finally did take notice, according to material covering their confrontation on Mandalore, he treated Maul's rise not with pride but with the specific cold irritation of a man discovering that a tool he'd thrown away had quietly become dangerous enough to require his personal attention again, dispatching Vader-era resources to end it before it could grow further. It was not a failed weapon that Sidious threw away, it was a survivor. Sidious underestimated exactly once, and that once was enough for Maul to build an empire out of spite alone. Every Sith on this list from here upward will share some version of Sidious's mistake with Maul, assuming a discarded piece has stopped moving. Maul proves that assumption is a Sith Order tradition, not an isolated error, and it is a tradition that gets several of Sidious's own colleagues killed. But Maul's power, for all its fury, still had a hard ceiling. He was never a strategist. The next Sith Lord on this list had exactly what Maul lacked: patience, political genius, decades of careful maneuvering, and it still wasn't enough to save him from the one flaw that undid him. Number 13. Darth Tyrannus. A former Jedi Master, once considered one of the greatest lightsaber duelists the Order had ever produced, kneels before a hooded figure in a Coruscant apartment and swears an oath that will define the rest of the galaxy's history. It was not weakness that put him on his knees, it was the opposite. Dooku's fall is unusual among Sith Lords because it was not born from humiliation or desperation. According to his portrayal across Attack of the Clones and supplementary material detailing his backstory, Dooku left the Jedi Order as one of its most respected members, a council seat, a legendary duelist, the former master of Qui-Gon Jinn. His break from the Jedi came from disillusionment with the Order's stagnation and corruption within the Senate, not personal defeat. This matters because it means Dooku entered the Sith not broken, but disappointed. He believed he was choosing a philosophy, not surrendering to one. That belief was his blind spot from the very first day, and Sidious knew it before Dooku did. It's worth dwelling on exactly what that disillusionment looked like from the inside, because it is the detail that separates Dooku from almost every other fallen Jedi on this list. He was not a Padawan struggling with fear or attachment. He was a senior statesman of the Jedi Order, decades into a distinguished career, watching a republic he'd sworn to protect grow visibly corrupt around him, a Senate more interested in trade disputes and taxation than in the erosion of its own founding principles, a Jedi Council increasingly cautious to the point of paralysis. According to supplementary material detailing his years before Attack of the Clones, Dooku's growing frustration was not a secret from his fellow Jedi. It was a subject of genuine debate within the Order, with some council members quietly sympathetic to his critiques, even as they rejected his eventual solution. He did not vanish into darkness. He walked out the front door in full view of colleagues who respected him, convinced he was choosing integrity over compromise. Dooku's decade as Darth Tyrannus is a masterclass in political Sith work, the kind that never shows up in lightsaber duels. He orchestrated the creation of the droid army through Geonosis, manipulated the Trade Federation, personally recruited Jango Fett as the clone template, and ran an entire shadow war designed to look, from the Jedi's perspective, like an organic galactic crisis rather than an engineered one. This was Sidious's masterstroke, and Dooku was the instrument executing it flawlessly for 10 years, without the Jedi Order ever identifying the true architect behind the curtain. But here is the detail almost every ranking skips. Dooku, despite a decade of flawless service, was never told the truth. He believed he was Sidious's successor. He was not. He was Grievous's babysitter and Anakin's recruiter, a placeholder Sidious always intended to discard the moment a more useful apprentice was ready. Dooku's final duel, cut down by Anakin Skywalker on Sidious's direct order, on Sidious's own ship in front of Sidious himself, was not a battlefield loss. It was an execution his own master ordered. Consider the Geonosis operation alone. Dooku did not simply hire an army. He engineered a decade-long deception in which the Republic itself would be manoeuvred into commissioning the clone army that would fight his own droid forces, meaning the entire Clone Wars, from the Republic's perspective a war of necessity, was in truth a war Dooku and Sidious had manufactured on both sides simultaneously. Dooku personally recruited Jango Fett. Dooku personally oversaw the Geonosian foundries. Dooku personally handled Newt Gunray and the Trade Federation's compliance. No detail of the galaxy's central conflict escaped his management, and the Jedi Council spent years treating him as a secondary threat behind the Trade Federation's blockades. The Confederacy of Independent Systems itself, the political apparatus Dooku built and publicly led as its head of state, is worth understanding as more than window dressing for the droid war. According to material detailing the Separatist crisis, Dooku spent years cultivating genuine grievances among thousands of star systems disillusioned with Republic bureaucracy and Trade Federation exploitation, giving his Shadow War a plausible political foundation that made it far harder for the Jedi and the Senate to recognize as manufactured rather than organic. He was not simply commanding droid armies, he was running a functioning galactic government in parallel to the Republic, complete with its own economic policy, diplomatic corps and public messaging, an administrative achievement that, on its own, would be remarkable even without the secret war layered underneath it. His lightsaber skill, often underrated in rankings that focus purely on force power, deserves its own note. Dooku defeated both Obi-Wan Kenobi and Anakin Skywalker in direct combat on Geonosis, wounding Kenobi and severing Anakin's arm, and was only driven off by Yoda's direct intervention. One of the only recorded instances of Yoda entering combat personally during the entire war. That is not the record of a placeholder. That is the record of one of the deadliest duelists the galaxy produced in a generation. Discarded anyway, because Sidious's plan for the endgame never had room for a Sith Master who remembered being a Jedi. Dooku's fighting style itself reflects the duality at the core of his character. According to material analysing his combat record, he employed Makashi, an elegant, economical lightsaber form associated historically with formal duelists rather than brute force combatants, a style that prizes precision and minimal wasted motion over overwhelming aggression. It is, in other words, a Jedi Master's form, refined over decades within the Order he eventually abandoned, repurposed without modification for Sith use. Dooku never had to reinvent how he fought when he fell. He simply pointed the same mastery at new targets, which is itself a quiet, damning detail about how little the dark side actually needed to change about him to make him useful. It was not incompetence that ended Dooku. It was the same trap that catches every political Sith Lord on this list. Believing loyalty upward earns loyalty downward. Dooku gave Sidious a decade of unbroken strategic brilliance, and received, in exchange, exactly the fate Sidious had planned for him from the beginning. He was never the heir. He was the bridge, and bridges get walked across and left behind. But there is a Sith Lord on this list who understood that exact trap decades before Dooku fell into it, who built an entire philosophy around never letting a master discard you, and who nearly rewrote the Sith Order's rules to make sure it never happened to anyone again. Number 12. Darth Bane. One survivor walks away from a battlefield littered with the corpses of the Sith Order's entire leadership, an order that had numbered in the thousands only years before. He does not celebrate. He rewrites the rules so that this never happens to the Sith again, and in doing so, guarantees it will happen to every Sith after him, one at a time, forever. Bane's origin, detailed across the Star Wars, Darth Bane novel trilogy, begins in brutal poverty on Apatros, under an abusive drunken father. He clawed his way into the Sith Brotherhood of Darkness, a Sith Order structured at the time as a sprawling council of dozens of Sith Lords, each manoeuvring against the others for advantage. Bane watched that structure from the inside and identified its terminal flaw before anyone else did. A Sith Order large enough to have internal politics is an order weak enough to be destroyed by its own infighting. The mining world of Apatros deserves a beat of its own attention, because it shapes everything Bane became. According to the Darth Bane trilogy, young Dessel, the name he was born with, grew up watching his father drink away what little the family had while his mother suffered under that neglect, an upbringing that taught him early and viscerally that strength was the only currency that mattered, and that sentiment was a luxury the powerless couldn't afford. He escaped that life first into indentured mining labour, and later into the ranks of a mercenary army, developing a reputation for battlefield ruthlessness, long before he had ever heard the word Sith. By the time he encountered the Sith Brotherhood of Darkness, he was already in effect pre-trained for their philosophy. He simply needed a name for what he already believed. The Jedi eventually did destroy it. The entire Brotherhood of Darkness at the Battle of Ruusan, wiped out almost to the last member through the deployment of a superweapon called the Thought Bomb. Bane survived. Not through superior combat skill in the final battle, but because he alone had already concluded the Brotherhood's structure was doomed, and positioned himself to walk away from its death rather than die inside it. The Thought Bomb's mechanics are worth explaining briefly, because they clarify exactly how narrow Bane's survival actually was. According to the trilogy, the weapon was designed by a coalition of Jedi specifically to annihilate the concentrated dark side presence the Brotherhood's leadership represented, drawing dozens of Force-sensitive lives, Jedi and Sith alike, into a single catastrophic implosion. Bane's escape depended on a specific obscure piece of Sith knowledge, the ability to place himself into a state of suspended animation deep enough to survive being caught at the very edge of the blast, a technique most of his fellow Sith Lords either didn't know or considered beneath their dignity to bother learning. His survival was not luck. It was the direct product of the same instinct that made him distrust the Brotherhood's culture in the first place, a willingness to learn unglamorous, unfashionable knowledge that more arrogant Sith Lords dismissed. What he did next is the single most consequential act by any individual Sith Lord in the entire 2,000-year history of the Order. He created the rule of two, one master, one apprentice, no more. According to the Darth Bane trilogy, his reasoning was mathematical rather than emotional. A Sith Order of thousands generates thousands of competing ambitions, and competing ambitions generate the kind of chaos the Jedi can exploit. Two Sith, locked in permanent tension, generate discipline instead. The apprentice must become strong enough to kill the master, or the Order stagnates. The master must remain strong enough to prevent that, or the Order is betrayed. Weakness, in either direction, becomes self-correcting through murder. Bane did not simply theorize the rule of two, he enforced it personally in his own lifetime against his own apprentice. According to the Darth Bane trilogy, his first true apprentice, Githany, was passed over in favour of Zannah, a choice Bane made not out of favouritism but cold calculation. Zannah's potential, measured across years of testing, simply exceeded Githany's. When Githany and another rival, Qasim, conspired against him, Bane killed them both without hesitation, demonstrating in his own actions the exact principle his rule demanded. Sentiment does not survive contact with Sith survival math. Githany's story is worth a moment of its own sympathy, because it illustrates how mechanically cold Bane's philosophy actually was in practice. She was not a failed apprentice in any conventional sense. By most measures available in the trilogy, she was a talented, capable Sith in her own right, skilled enough to have been a serious contender for Bane's mantle under almost any other master's evaluation. She was passed over purely because Zannah's specific aptitude for the kind of adaptive, patient power Bane wanted to cultivate outmatched her, and once passed over, her resentment made her a liability the rule of two's own logic demanded be eliminated rather than managed. Bane did not hesitate over that decision the way a more sentimental master might have. That is, in miniature, the entire philosophy of the rule of two. Talent alone was never going to be enough to save you. The final test of his philosophy is the most telling. Bane trained Zannah knowing, by the rule's own logic, that she was meant to eventually kill him and take his place. He did not soften that inevitability. He accelerated her training specifically to make sure she would be ready, reasoning that an apprentice unprepared to overthrow her master was an apprentice who had failed her purpose. When Zannah finally did strike him down, it was not a betrayal in Bane's own framework. It was the system completing itself exactly as designed. The clearest possible proof that Bane valued the Order's long-term power over his own individual survival. It was not survival alone that made Bane significant. It was the decision, made in the ashes of an order thousands strong, that fewer Sith locked in constant lethal competition would produce more power than an army of them ever could. Every single Sith Lord ranked above Bane on this list, everyone, without exception, exists inside the philosophical architecture Bane personally built. Sidious, Plagueis, Vader, all rule of two Sith. Bane is not the most powerful individual on this list. He is the single most influential mind on it, because he built the machine that eventually produced the entity at the very top. But Bane's rule had one flaw baked into its foundation from the start, a flaw that would eventually produce a Sith apprentice who killed his master not out of ambition, but out of something closer to panic, and who never recovered from what that panic cost him. Number 11, Darth Malak. A Sith Lord orders the bombardment of his own master's flagship, killing thousands of his own soldiers along with her, and spends the rest of his life unable to explain, even to himself, whether it was ambition or terror that pulled the trigger. Darth Malak was not always Malak. He was Alec Squinquagesimus, one of the Jedi Republic's most decorated war heroes during the Mandalorian Wars, a friend and battlefield companion to Revan before either of them touched the dark side. According to the narrative established in Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic, Malak followed Revan into the dark side not as an equal partner, but as a devoted subordinate. Brilliant, powerful, but always defined in relation to Revan's genius rather than his own. That dependency is the wound. Malak was never built to lead. He was built to follow a leader whose vision he trusted completely, and when that leader was captured, mind-wiped, and effectively erased by the Jedi Council, Malak inherited an empire he was never actually prepared to run alone. It's worth understanding what that partnership looked like before the fall, because it reframes everything that comes after. During the Mandalorian Wars, Alec and Revan were, by most accounts referenced in the game's supplementary material, closer to equal partners than the master-apprentice dynamic their Sith identities would later impose. They planned campaigns together, argued strategy as peers, and were both viewed by the Jedi volunteers who followed them into the unauthorized war as co-commanders rather than leader and subordinate. The Sith hierarchy Malak inherited after their shared fall to the dark side was, in that light, less a reflection of genuine ability, and more a reflection of which one of them the dark power they encountered beyond the Rim chose to elevate first. Malak spent years as the second name in a partnership that had, for a time, genuinely been closer to equal footing, which makes the sudden, total weight of sole command hit him without the gradual seasoning a more organic rise would have provided. His reign as Dark Lord of the Sith is defined by a specific telling contradiction. Overwhelming military power paired with strategic insecurity. He built the Star Forge into an armada capable of crushing the Republic. He also became obsessed, pathologically according to the game's own narrative framing, with the possibility that Revan, reconditioned by the Jedi and unaware of their own past, might return and reclaim what Malak saw as rightfully his. This obsession is what led Malak to attempt the assassination of his own former master, rather than simply defending his territory. The detail worth sitting with. Malak had every resource needed to simply outlast the threat. He did not trust himself to. He needed Revan gone specifically because some part of him never stopped believing Revan was the real Sith Lord, and he was only ever the strongest lieutenant. The Star Forge itself is worth pausing on, because it is one of the single greatest strategic assets any individual on this list ever controlled, an ancient factory station capable of producing warships and droid armies at a rate no conventional shipyard in the galaxy could match, drawing power directly from a nearby star. Under Malak's command, it produced a fleet large enough to threaten Republic space directly, a feat none of the Sith Lords ranked below him on this list ever came close to matching in raw material output. Malak was not weak. He commanded more hardware than Exar Kun, Naga Sadow and Marka Ragnos combined. The origins of the Star Forge deserve a moment of their own explanation, because the station itself is arguably as important a character in Malak's story as any individual. According to the game's lore, it was constructed by the ancient Rakatan Infinite Empire, a civilization that had once dominated the galaxy through a form of dark side technology fused directly to force-sensitive control. A station that could translate raw dark side power into material output at a scale no conventional industrial base could match. Revan discovered it during his own journey into the unknown regions, and it was Revan, not Malak, who first understood how to make it operational. Malak inherited that discovery already functioning, meaning the single greatest material asset of his reign was never something he built himself. It was something he was handed, and the anxiety of being the steward of someone else's masterwork rather than the architect of his own runs through everything else about his character. And yet, when the moment came to defend that empire against a single infiltration team led by his own former master, Malak's command structure buckled. According to Knights of the Old Republic, key officers aboard the Starforge wavered or actively assisted the Republic strike team once it became clear Revan had returned, not out of loyalty to the Republic, but because Malak had never built the kind of personal loyalty among his subordinates that Revan once commanded effortlessly. Power without belief turned out to be a hollow foundation the moment it was tested. It was not a lack of power that defined Malak's downfall. It was the gap between the power he held and the confidence he never developed to match it. He commanded a fleet capable of ending the Republic, and still could not shake the belief that he was, at his core, second place. That gap is what Bastila Shan and the reconditioned Revan ultimately exploited to end his reign, not through superior firepower, but by proving in the final confrontation that Malak's own soldiers no longer fully believed in him either. But the Sith Lord who trained Malak's philosophy of ruthless pragmatism into a weapon was already gone by the time Malak took the throne, and the next entry on this list belongs to someone who never wanted a throne at all, and whose entire power came from that refusal. Number 10. Darth Traya. A blind old woman travels the galaxy pretending to be a harmless wanderer, teaching a Jedi exile lessons that sound like philosophy and turn out to be a scalpel. She was cast out by 3 different orders in her lifetime. Each one believed it had won. Kreia, Darth Traya, formerly the Jedi Master Aaron Kay, occupies a position unique on this list. She was rejected by the Jedi Council for her radical philosophy, then betrayed and physically wounded by 2 of her own Sith apprentices, Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus, whom she had trained and who eventually turned on her in what the game Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, the Sith Lords frames as an inevitable consequence of her own teachings. She taught them that dependency was weakness. They applied that lesson to her. This is Traya's defining irony, and the game is explicit about it. The woman who taught an entire philosophy of severing attachment to the Force was destroyed, in part by 2 apprentices who took that lesson more literally than she intended. Her time as a Jedi Master under the name Aaron Kay is worth expanding, because it establishes exactly how far her philosophy travelled before it became recognisably Sith. According to material detailing her earlier life, she was already a controversial figure within the Jedi Order before ever touching the dark side, pursuing lines of Force theory the Council considered dangerously unorthodox, questioning, long before her expulsion, whether the Jedi's own relationship to the Force was as balanced and benevolent as the Order's teachings assumed. She was not seduced into radical thinking by Sith influence. She arrived at heretical questions from inside the Jedi tradition itself, which is part of why the Council's eventual rejection of her felt, to her, less like a correction, and more like confirmation that the Order was unwilling to follow its own questions to their logical end. What makes Traya dangerous is not lightsaber skill. By the point she appears in the Sith Lords, she is elderly, blind, and physically diminished. Her power is entirely psychological and philosophical. She spends the game's runtime systematically dismantling the Jedi Exile's understanding of the Force itself, arguing across numerous dialogues that the Force is not a benevolent, balanced energy, but something closer to a predatory system that punishes attachment and rewards those willing to cut themselves off from it. The specific detail that separates her from every other Sith on this list: she does not want followers. According to the game's narrative, her ultimate goal is closer to eliminating the Force's influence over the galaxy entirely, a philosophy so extreme that it puts her at odds with the Sith Order itself, not just the Jedi. She was, in a real sense, exiled from 3 different ideological homes across her life, because every one of them was, to her, insufficiently willing to see what she saw. Her relationship with Sion and Nihilus, before their eventual betrayal, deserves more detail than a single sentence can capture. According to the game's narrative and its supplementary material, Traya found both of them already broken by trauma. Sion consumed by pain so total it became the literal source of his continued unnatural survival. Nihilus reduced to something closer to a hungering void by the devastation at Malachor V. and rather than healing that damage, she deliberately cultivated it, treating their wounds as raw material for a specific philosophical experiment. Could damaged, hollowed-out Force users be shaped into something more dangerous than conventionally whole ones, precisely because they had nothing left to lose? Both of her students proved her right in the most literal, devastating way possible. Both of them also eventually proved her theory's fatal flaw: something that has learned to need nothing does not stay loyal to the person who taught it that lesson. Her manipulation of the Jedi exile across the Sith Lords is arguably the single most sophisticated long-form psychological campaign run by any figure on this list. She does not simply lecture, she tests. Every companion the exile recruits, every planet they visit, every moral choice they're offered is, according to the game's own design documentation and narrative structure, engineered by Kreia to push the exile toward a specific philosophical conclusion about the nature of the Force and the wound the exile carries from Malachor 5. She spends the entire game teaching a lesson so subtle that most of her students, including, arguably, the exile themselves, never fully register they were being taught at all. Her final confrontation with the exile is not a lightsaber duel in the way the other entries on this list resolve. It is an argument, conducted through the Force itself, over whether the exile will affirm dependency on others or complete Kreia's philosophy of severance. The specific detail worth noting: Kreia's power at this point is drawn largely from siphoning the strength of everyone the exile has bonded with across the game, meaning her final trial is, structurally, a battle over whether connection to others is a source of strength or a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. That question is never fully resolved by the narrative, which is itself the most Kreia thing about the entire ending. It was not physical weakness that limited her impact. It was the fact that her philosophy was too corrosive even for the people who should have been her natural allies. Kreia proves something none of the Sith ranked below her demonstrate: that ideas can be more dangerous than armies, and that the Sith Order itself was by her account only ever a smaller trap inside the larger trap of the Force. But one of the two apprentices who betrayed her took her lesson about severing attachment to an extreme even she never intended, and became something the galaxy had never actually seen before: a Sith Lord who fed on life itself. Number 9. Darth Nihilus. A world dies in a single night. Not conquered, not bombarded, consumed. Every living thing on the planet's surface drained of the Force simultaneously, as if the world itself had been unplugged. The being responsible does not remember doing it. He does not remember much of anything anymore. Darth Nihilus's origin is the darkest on this list, and one of the vaguest by design. According to the Sith Lords, he was present at the Mandalorian Wars-era devastation of a world called Malachor 5, caught in the aftermath of a superweapon detonation that tore a wound in the Force itself. What survived the blast was not, by the game's own framing, entirely human anymore. Nihilus became a hunger given a body, a being defined by an insatiable need to consume Force energy, wearing a mask because, according to in-game dialogue, looking directly at what remained of his face risked revealing there was almost nothing left behind it. The devastation at Malachor 5 deserves fuller context, because it is the single event that produces 2 of the 15 names on this list. According to the game's lore, the mass shadow generator deployed there was a super weapon of last resort, intended to end the Mandalorian Wars decisively by collapsing the battlefield in on itself, and it succeeded at a cost that horrified even the commanders who authorized it. A wound torn in the Force so severe that echoes of the dead were said to linger in the wreckage for years afterward. Whoever was close enough to that event and survived it was fundamentally altered by the exposure. Nihilus was one of those survivors, and unlike his fellow survivor Mitra Surik, the Jedi exile whose own connection to the Force was severed by the same catastrophe, Nihilus did not lose his connection to the Force. He lost everything else, and the Force itself became the only thing left to define him. His entire modus operandi across the game's narrative is different from every Sith Lord ranked below him. He does not conquer planets for resources or ideology. He devours them for sustenance. The destruction of Qatar, an entire population of Miraluka Force sensitives wiped out in an instant to feed him, is presented not as strategy but as something closer to an animal's feeding behavior scaled up to a planetary level. Viskis, Vruk Lamar and other characters across the game's narrative describe him less as a person and more as a natural disaster that happens to wear Sith robes. The detail that separates Nihilus from a simple monster. Kriya, his own former master, is terrified of him, not because of raw combat power alone, but because she recognizes he has moved past the point where philosophy or manipulation can reach him. You cannot negotiate with hunger. The destruction of Qatar deserves its own accounting because the scale of it is almost impossible to convey in ordinary terms. According to the Sith Lords, an entire population of Force-sensitive Miraluka, men, women, children, an entire planetary culture, died simultaneously the moment Nihilus arrived in orbit, their life force drawn out of their bodies and into him in a single event visible across the galaxy as a wound in the Force itself. Viscus, the exchange crime lord who witnesses the aftermath, describes finding a world of corpses with no visible cause of death, no battle, no bombardment, just absence. What makes Nihilus survivable at all from a narrative standpoint is that his hunger has a rhythm to it. Periods where his need must be fed again, moments where his crew and his fellow Sith, Darth Sion, have to manage him almost like a force of nature rather than a commander. Visas Ma, his own apprentice for a time before defecting to the exile, describes serving him not out of loyalty but out of terror, tasked with locating worlds rich enough in the Force to satisfy him before his hunger turned inward on his own ship and crew instead. Visas Ma's own perspective, once she joins the exile's crew across the game, offers the fullest window available into what serving Nihilus actually felt like day to day. According to her characterization in the Sith Lords, she describes an existence spent constantly triangulating where the next feeding needed to happen, treating star charts and population estimates less like military intelligence and more like a desperate accounting of how long a given crew, a given world, a given fragile equilibrium could last before Nihilus's hunger outpaced whatever supply she had managed to locate for him. Her defection to the exile is framed, within the narrative, not as a conventional betrayal, but as an escape from an entity she had never truly served in any way that resembled ordinary Sith loyalty. She had been managing a catastrophe, not following a master. It was not ambition that made Nihilus dangerous. It was the complete absence of anything resembling a self that could be reasoned with, bargained with, or turned. Every Sith Lord ranked below him on this list wanted something. Power, revenge, recognition. Nihilus wanted nothing in the way a person wants things. He simply needed the way a black hole needs, and that distinction is exactly what makes him harder to stop than several more conventionally powerful Sith Lords ranked above him would be in a straight fight. But even an entity capable of draining a planet's life force in a single night is still, in the end, a product of a specific place and time, a wound inflicted at Malachor 5. The next Sith Lord on this list needed no wound, no tragedy, no external cause at all. He simply wanted to know everything and very nearly got what he wanted. Number 8. Exar Kun. A former Jedi Padawan descends into a buried Sith tomb searching for forbidden knowledge, and comes back out wearing another man's ambition like a second skin. The tomb belonged to Freeden Nad. What walked out of it belonged to something older still. Exar Kun's fall, chronicled extensively across the tales of the Jedi comic series, begins with something almost mundane by Sith standards: intellectual restlessness. Kun was a supremely talented Jedi student who found the Order's caution suffocating. He wanted knowledge the Jedi Council refused to teach, and rather than accept that refusal he went looking for it himself. First through the spirit of the long-dead Sith Lord Freeden Nad, and later through the actual spirit of Nagasado, a Sith Lord dead for 4,000 years by that point, whom Kun sought out specifically because Nad's knowledge wasn't enough. His time as a Jedi student under Master Vodosyosk Bas is worth expanding on, because it establishes the pattern of restlessness that defines everything Kun does afterward. According to Tales of the Jedi, Kun was, by every conventional measure, one of the most gifted students of his generation, a prodigy in lightsaber combat and force theory alike, the kind of Padawan whose masters expected great things from him, almost from the start. That very expectation seems to have fed his frustration. He interpreted the Jedi Order's caution as a failure of nerve rather than a philosophy of restraint, and according to the comic's framing, he began seeking out restricted texts and forbidden lore well before his formal fall, treating the Jedi Archive's locked sections less as boundaries and more as a personal challenge. What makes Kun's rise distinct is the sheer speed and audacity of his power grab. Within a matter of years, he had not only mastered Sith sorcery far beyond what most trained Sith apprentices achieve in a lifetime, he had also seduced a second former Jedi, Ulic Qel-Droma, into becoming his co-conspirator, and together the two of them ignited what became known as the Great Sith War, a conflict that pulled in the Krath, an entire cult of dark side dabblers on Onderon, and eventually drew the full weight of the Jedi Order into open war. Kun's seduction of Ulic Qel-Droma deserves closer attention, because the two men arrived at their fall through almost opposite psychological routes, which makes their partnership more interesting than a simple two Jedi go bad together summary suggests. According to Tales of the Jedi, Ulic was sent by the Jedi Council on an authorized, sanctioned undercover mission specifically to infiltrate the Krath cult on Onderon and understand the dark side threat brewing there from the inside, a mission that by design required him to actually practice dark side techniques in order to maintain his cover. Kun, watching from the outside, recognized in that assignment an opportunity no manipulation of his own could have manufactured. A Jedi Council-sanctioned excuse for one of the Order's own to genuinely explore the dark side, with an ally already positioned to fall the moment the line between performance and genuine belief blurred. Ulic's fall, in other words, began as obedience to the Jedi Council before it ever became loyalty to Kun. The specific detail worth dwelling on: Kun's endgame was never simple conquest. According to Tales of the Jedi, his final act was to sacrifice the entire population of his own students on Yavin 4, draining their life force to transform himself into a spirit bound to the planet, trading a physical body and a Sith empire for something closer to permanence. He did not want to rule the galaxy, he wanted to outlast it. The Great Sith War itself is worth walking through in more detail than most rankings bother with. Kun did not simply raise an army, he engineered a two-front seduction, corrupting Ulic Qel-Droma from within the Jedi Order's own ranks, while simultaneously cultivating the Krath cult on Onderon into a fully armed military faction. According to Tales of the Jedi, Ulic's fall was so severe that he was, for a time, the more publicly feared of the two Sith Lords, leading armies and dueling Jedi Masters directly, meaning Kun's greatest strategic achievement wasn't a battle he won personally. It was a war he started and then let someone else's ambition carry forward while he pursued deeper, more dangerous knowledge in the background. Ulic's eventual arc, his defeat, his blinding, his years spent as a broken, powerless remnant of the feared Sith Lord he'd once been, and his final redemption at his own sister's hand, is technically outside the scope of Kun's own entry, but it casts a long shadow backward over how Kun's manipulation should be read. Kun built a co-conspirator whose fall was, in the end, more visible and more consequential to the wider galaxy than his own. A war fought largely in Ulic's name, ended largely because of Ulic's choices, while Kun himself remained the quieter architect operating one step removed from the worst of the public consequences. That is, in its own dark way, a preview of exactly the kind of strategic distance more senior Sith Lords further up this list would later perfect. His final ritual on Yavin 4 is the detail that separates Kun from every conqueror ranked below him. Facing defeat as Jedi forces closed in on his temple, Kun did not attempt to flee or negotiate. He performed a mass sacrifice of his own followers, draining their combined life force through Sith magic to transform himself into a spirit permanently anchored to the moon, escaping death entirely rather than accepting it, a fate so unsettling that Yavin 4 remained a place radiating dark side energy for 4,000 years afterward, eventually detected by Kylo Ren's generation of dark side practitioners exploring the same ruins. It was not weakness or dependency that drove Exar Kun. It was appetite without limit, an intelligence so hungry for forbidden knowledge that it consumed his own students as casually as it consumed centuries-old Sith texts. He is ranked above Nihilus not because he was stronger in raw force power, but because Nihilus was a hunger without a plan, while Kun was a hunger that built an empire, started a galactic war, and engineered his own immortality, all before the Jedi Order finally managed to seal him away on Yavin 4 for 4,000 years. But Kun's power, however vast, was borrowed, inherited from the knowledge of Sith Lords who came before him. The next entry on this list is one of those Sith Lords, the man whose tomb Kun raided first, and whose empire once stretched further than anything the galaxy had seen up to that point in history. Number 7. Nagasado. A Republic scout ship gets lost in deep space and stumbles onto something that should not exist. A fully developed empire of red-skinned Sith purebloods and their subjugated species, ruled by a magister obsessed with proving the Sith were never a footnote to galactic history. They were always meant to be the main event. Nagasado's origin is different from almost everyone else on this list because he was never an outsider, clawing his way into the Sith Order. He was born into it, one of the ruling magisters of the ancient Sith Empire on Korriban, a civilization descended from Dark Jedi exiles who had conquered the native Sith species roughly 1,000 years before Sado's own lifetime. His wound was not personal humiliation, it was institutional stagnation. An empire he believed had grown complacent, ruled by rival magisters more interested in preserving their own territory than expanding Sith power outward into the wider galaxy the Sith Empire didn't yet know existed. It's worth explaining, briefly, exactly what that ancient Sith Empire actually was, since it's an easy detail to gloss over. According to Golden Age of the Sith era material, roughly 1,000 years before Sado's lifetime, a faction of Dark Jedi exiled from the Galactic Republic following an earlier philosophical schism fled into unknown space and discovered Korriban, home to a native species already called the Sith, a red-skinned people with their own dark side traditions and sorcery. Rather than simply coexisting with them, the exiled Dark Jedi conquered them, positioning themselves as a ruling caste of magisters over the native Sith population, while absorbing much of that native species' sorcerous tradition into their own philosophy. By Sado's era, generations of intermarriage and cultural fusion meant the ruling class, including Sado himself, were as much inheritors of that original native Sith bloodline as they were descendants of the exiled Dark Jedi who had first conquered it, a detail that matters because Sado's ambition to expand outward can be read as an attempt to reclaim, for both halves of his ancestry, a galactic relevance the isolationist policies of rival magisters like Kresh had denied them. According to Star Wars Tales of the Sith and the broader Golden Age of the Sith era material, when a Republic scout ship crewed by Gav and Jory Darrigan crash-landed on Korriban, Sado saw not an intrusion but an opportunity, proof that a vast, unconquered galaxy lay beyond Sith space, ripe for expansion. His rival magister, Ludo Kresh, wanted the intruders executed and the secret of Sith space preserved through isolation. Sado wanted war. The two magisters' disagreement escalated into open Sith civil conflict, and Sado won it, but the specific tactical detail worth noting is how he used illusions, ancient Sith sorcery, and manipulated beast-riding warfare to rout Kresh's forces, then pursued the fleeing survivors personally to make sure no rival claim to leadership could reconstitute itself later. The Darrigans themselves deserve a slightly closer look, because their accidental arrival is one of the great hinge points of Star Wars history, an entire era-defining conflict set in motion by two ordinary hyperspace explorers who had no idea what they'd stumbled into. According to Tales of the Sith, Gav Darrigan in particular became a pawn in Sado's broader scheme, manipulated into believing he could return to Republic space as an ambassador for a Sith alliance, when in truth, Sado's real goal was using the Darrigans' knowledge of Republic hyperspace routes to plan an invasion the Republic would never see coming. That manipulation of two frightened, disoriented strangers into unwitting instruments of an entire war is a small-scale preview of the exact kind of long-game deception several Sith Lords much higher on this list would later perfect at galactic scale. With Korriban's rival faction crushed, Sado launched a full invasion of the Republic itself, the first great hyperspace war in galactic history, a conflict so significant it reshaped how the Republic and the Jedi Order treated the Sith as a threat category for the next 4,000 years. He did not win that war. Republican Jedi forces, once mobilized, proved capable of matching Sith sorcery with sheer numbers and coordinated Jedi strategy, eventually driving Sado's forces back to Korriban itself. What makes Sado remarkable is not the war he lost, but what he built in defeat. Driven from Korriban, he retreated to the hidden world of Yavin 4, the same moon Exar Kun would later claim as his own base 4,000 years afterward, and there, according to material detailing his final centuries, subjugated the native Masasi people, breeding and training them into a warrior caste loyal to Sith rule. He spent the remainder of his life not raising a new army to reclaim Korriban, but constructing an entire hidden civilization designed to outlast his own lifetime, seeding temples and sorcerous knowledge across Yavin 4 specifically, so that some future Sith, generations later, would find it and inherit what he had built. The Massassi themselves are worth understanding as more than a footnote army. According to the era's material, they were not simply conscripted. Sado's sorcery reshaped them over generations, breeding them into a hulking, powerfully built warrior caste whose entire cultural identity became organized around temple building and service to Sith spirits. A transformation so thorough that their descendants were still recognizably Massassi, still tending temple ruins in Sado's name, 4,000 years later when Exar Kun arrived to claim them. Sado did not just build a hidden base. He engineered an entire self-sustaining religious culture whose sole purpose, across 40 centuries, was waiting for a Sith worthy of inheriting what he'd left behind. That plan worked exactly as intended, which is the detail most rankings miss entirely. Exar Kun's entire rise to power 4,000 years later was built directly on Sado's buried knowledge. Kun did not stumble onto Yavin 4's dark side energy by accident. He was, in a very real sense, completing a project Sado had started millennia before, either Kun or the modern Sith Order, as Sidious would eventually define it, even existed. Sado did not just found an empire. He built a seed designed to germinate across thousands of years of galactic history, and it did. It was not the great hyperspace war's failure that defined Naga Sado. It was the decision, in the aftermath of total defeat, to think in centuries rather than years, to build not for his own reign but for whichever Sith, generations later, would be capable of finishing what he started. Every Sith Lord on this list who benefits from ancient Sith knowledge, buried holocrons, or forgotten temple sorcery is, whether they know it or not, drawing on an infrastructure Sado built specifically because he refused to accept that his own defeat had to be permanent. But Sado was not the first Magister to rule the ancient Sith Empire, nor the one who built its foundations. That distinction belongs to a king whose tomb, even 4,000 years after his death, was still considered so significant that two rival Sith Lords went to war over who would be permitted to enter it. Number 6. Marka Ragnos. A funeral procession 1,000 years in the past becomes, in the era of Exar Kun, a ghost story so powerful that two of the deadliest Force users of their generation duel each other, just for the right to hear it. The dead king's name is spoken like a warning. It is also spoken like a prayer. Marka Ragnos occupies a strange position on this list. He is remembered less for any single documented defeat or humiliation, and more for the sheer scale of what he built during his reign as Dark Lord of the Sith, centuries before Naga Sado's era. According to material detailing the ancient Sith Empire's history, Ragnos ruled during what is often characterized as the high point of the old Sith civilization's stability and expansion, a period when the various Sith purebloods, Massassi, and other subjugated species under Sith rule were unified under a single Magister's authority more completely than at almost any other point in the Empire's history. To understand how remarkable that stability actually was, it helps to compare Ragnos's reign to what came both before and after it. The generations of Sith Magisters preceding him were defined by exactly the kind of fractious infighting that would later doom Naga Sado's own era. Rival bloodlines squabbling over Korriban's limited territory, alliances shifting so quickly that outside observers, had there been any, would have struggled to identify a single coherent Sith state at all. Ragnos's genius, according to the legends built up around his reign, was less about any single conquest, and more about administrative consolidation, uniting rival Magister bloodlines under terms all of them found more profitable than continued warfare, and doing it thoroughly enough that the peace held for the remainder of his life, rather than collapsing the moment any individual conflict was resolved. His wound, if the formula demands one, is closer to a warning than a defeat. Even the most stable, most powerful Sith Empire in galactic history did not survive its own founder's death intact. Ragnos understood, according to the legends built up around him in later Sith texts, that Sith power structures are fundamentally unstable the moment the strongest individual holding them together is gone, a lesson Naga Sado and Ludo Kresh would prove correct centuries later when Ragnos's own empire fractured into the civil war Sado eventually won. The specific detail that separates Ragnos from the other ancient Sith on this list is the reverence his name still commanded 4,000 years after his death. In Star Wars, Tales of the Jedi, both Exar Kun and Keldroma travel to Ragnos' tomb specifically to duel one another for the right to learn from his spirit, treating access to Ragnos' knowledge as a prize worth risking death over, not for wealth, not for territory, but purely for the accumulated understanding of Sith power a single ancient king was believed to still possess even in death. Few individuals anywhere in galactic history commanded that kind of posthumous authority. It's worth pausing on why Kun and Keldroma specifically sought Ragnos out, rather than any of the other ancient Sith spirits available to them. According to Tales of the Jedi, Ragnos' tomb was understood, even 4,000 years after his death, to hold knowledge and sorcery beyond what even Freed and Nad, the more immediately accessible Sith spirit both men had already learned from, possessed. Nad had been a student of the tradition Ragnos represented. Ragnos was closer to its source. Seeking him out was, in effect, an acknowledgement by two of the most dangerous dark side practitioners of their own era that they had already exhausted what a lesser teacher could offer them, and needed to go straight to the origin of the power they were chasing. Ragnos' spirit, when finally summoned, does not simply hand over power. According to that same storyline, Ragnos' ghost tests both Kun and Keldroma, delivering judgment on which of them is worthy of his knowledge, a scene that positions him not as a conquering warlord to be feared, but as something closer to a final arbiter of Sith legitimacy, a figure whose approval or rejection carried more symbolic weight, even 1,000 years after his death, than the living Sith Council's approval would have. Ragnos' reign itself, according to the broader historical record built up around this era, was defined by aggressive consolidation, bringing rival Sith bloodlines and territories under centralized rule through a combination of sorcery, military conquest, and, crucially, successful long-term administration. Unlike Sado, whose empire fractured within his own lifetime, Ragnos' rule held together for the duration of his reign without the kind of internal civil war that plagued nearly every other Dark Lord on this list. That stability, rare among Sith rulers by both temperament and structural design, is precisely why his name endured as a legend rather than a cautionary tale. It was not conquest alone that made Marka Ragnos significant. It was the fact that he built something durable enough to still be worth fighting over 1,000 years after his death, a legacy so complete that later Sith Lords didn't just study his methods, they treated his literal ghost as a final judge of their own worthiness. Every Sith Lord ranked above him on this list will eventually be measured, fairly or not, against the standard Ragnos set. Not just power in life, but power that outlives the body entirely. But even Ragnos' century-spanning legend pales against a figure who did not simply become a revered memory after death. A war hero the Republic once celebrated, who fell to the dark side, lost his memory entirely, and somehow became one of the most feared Sith Lords in galactic history twice, as two different people inside a single lifetime. Number 5. Darth Revan. A Jedi war hero disappears into the Outer Rim chasing the remnants of the Mandalorian threat, and comes back a Sith Lord commanding a fleet the Republic has no answer for. Then the Jedi capture him, erase his mind entirely and rebuild him as a loyal agent of the Republic. Somehow, that isn't even the strangest part of his story. Revan's fall, as established across Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic and its surrounding material, begins not from personal weakness, but from a decision the Jedi Council explicitly forbade. Entering the Mandalorian Wars to defend Republic worlds the Council had decided, for political reasons, not to protect. Revan and his closest friend Malak defied the Council's order, rallied Jedi volunteers into an unauthorized army, and won the war the Council refused to fight. That victory is the wound, in the sense the formula demands. Revan was right, and being right about a war the Jedi Council was wrong to avoid taught him that Jedi caution itself could be a form of moral failure. The Mandalorian Wars themselves deserve fuller context, because the Jedi Council's refusal to intervene was not simple cowardice. It reflected a genuine, defensible, philosophical position that Revan's story ultimately argues against without ever fully disproving. According to the game's framing, the Council believed the Mandalorian threat, however brutal, did not yet represent the kind of civilization-ending danger that justified the Jedi abandoning their traditional restraint from direct military command. Revan and Malak looked at the same evidence. worlds burning, refugees fleeing, a Republic military structurally unprepared for the scale of the Mandalorian assault, and reached the opposite conclusion. Their unauthorized intervention did save worlds the Council's caution would have left undefended. It also set a precedent one both men internalized completely. The Jedi orthodoxy could be not just wrong but actively complicit in preventable suffering. A belief that made the next step, embracing an unknown dark power in defiance of everything the Order had taught them, feel to Revan less like a betrayal of Jedi values and more like their logical continuation. Chasing the fleeing remnants of the Mandalorian fleet into unmapped space beyond the Outer Rim, Revan and Malak encountered something the Republic had no records of. A source of dark power later identified across the game's narrative as connected to the ancient Sith Emperor's influence, predating even the material covered by Naga Sado's era. Whatever Revan found out there transformed him entirely. He returned not as a victorious Jedi general, but as a Sith Lord, and within a remarkably short span of time built a Sith Empire and a war fleet capable of directly threatening the Republic's core worlds, something no Sith Lord since Naga Sado's great hyperspace war had come close to achieving. The specific tactical detail that separates Revan from Malak, his own apprentice, is documented repeatedly across the game's narrative. Revan was the strategist, Malak was the hammer. Revan's war plans, according to briefings referenced throughout the story, were characterized by unpredictability and psychological pressure, as much as raw firepower, using terror and uncertainty to fracture Republic morale before fleets ever engaged directly. This is why, when the Jedi Council finally captured Revan rather than killing him, their decision was deliberate. They judged that whatever knowledge and strategic insight Revan possessed was too valuable to simply destroy. That capture itself deserves a closer look, because it represents one of the most consequential single decisions any Jedi Council makes anywhere on this list. According to the game's narrative, taking Revan alive rather than executing him on the spot required overriding the instinct of several Jedi present who believed, not unreasonably, that a Sith Lord of Revan's demonstrated capability was too dangerous to risk keeping alive under any circumstances. The Council's decision to attempt the mind wipe instead was, in effect, a bet that the strategic value of recovering Revan's knowledge outweighed the risk of the procedure failing, or the Sith Lord somehow reasserting control over his own reconditioned mind later. It very nearly did fail, in ways the Council could not have fully anticipated. What the Council did next has no real precedent among any other entry on this list. Rather than execute Revan or imprison him, they wiped his memory entirely and reconditioned him as a Republic agent, effectively creating a new person in Revan's body with no knowledge of the empire he'd built or the atrocities he'd committed as a Sith Lord. This reconditioned Revan is the player character across Knights of the Old Republic, uncovering his own forgotten identity as a Sith Lord, piece by piece across the game's story, culminating in the confrontation with Malak, his own former apprentice still ruling the empire the original Revan built, now believing his old master dead and replaced by a Jedi imposter. The process of that discovery is itself worth expanding on, because it's structurally unlike anything else in this ranking. A Sith Lord's entire arc, for most of the story, is told from the perspective of someone who does not yet know they are the Sith Lord in question. According to the game's narrative, fragments of Revan's suppressed memories resurface gradually through dreams, déjà vu at locations tied to his former empire, and moments of instinctive combat or force ability that the reconditioned identity has no conscious explanation for. A slow-motion unmasking that means the audience, unlike in every other entry on this list, experiences Revan's dual nature not as backstory delivered second-hand, but as a mystery the protagonist is solving about themselves in real time. The final confrontation is worth detailing because of what it proves about the difference between Revan and every Sith Lord ranked below him on this list. Even mind-wiped, even reconditioned as a Jedi loyal to the Republic, Revan's underlying strategic and force capability remained potent enough to defeat Malak, an apprentice who had spent years ruling an empire and commanding the Starforge's resources without him. According to the game's narrative and later expanded material covering Revan's subsequent journey into deep space to confront the true Sith Emperor behind his original fall, Revan's power was never really about the Sith training he received under Malak's rule. It ran deeper than any single allegiance, Jedi or Sith, could fully define. It was not the dark side alone that made Revan dangerous, and it was not the light side alone that made him formidable when reconditioned as a Jedi. It was the same strategic mind operating underneath both identities, proving that whatever the Jedi Council believed made Revan exceptional as a war hero was never erased by memory loss, and whatever made him exceptional as a Sith Lord was never fully a product of Malak's or the ancient Emperor's influence either. He is, uniquely among every figure on this list, proof that raw capability can survive the complete deletion of identity itself. But Revan's power, however singular, was still ultimately shaped by forces outside himself, an ancient Sith Emperor's influence he never fully controlled. The next entry on this list answers to no one for most of his life, right up until the day a single choice, made in a matter of seconds, undoes 20 years of careful manipulation by the single greatest Sith strategist in the Order's history. Number 4. Darth Vader. 9-year-old slave boy from Tatooine, chosen one of Jedi prophecy, youngest starfighter pilot to ever destroy a battle station the size of a small moon, 23 years old when he is burned alive on a volcanic riverbank and rebuilt inside a suit of black armor that will define the next 2 decades of his life. Every single one of those sentences describes the same person. Anakin Skywalker's fall chronicled across the entirety of the prequel trilogy and expanded material like Star Wars. Dark Lord, the rise of Darth Vader, is arguably the most thoroughly documented fall to the dark side in the franchise. Unlike almost every other Sith Lord on this list whose descent happened off-page or across time skips, Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader is shown scene by scene. Prophetic dreams of his mother's death that come true in the worst possible way, a Jedi Council that never fully trusted him, a secret marriage he was forced to hide, and a manipulative Chancellor who spent years positioning himself as the only authority figure willing to treat Anakin as an equal rather than a liability. It's worth going further back than the Council's mistrust, to the circumstances of Anakin's discovery in the first place, because the Jedi Order's relationship with him was compromised from the very beginning. He was found on Tatooine at age 9, far older than the infancy at which the Order traditionally began training prospective Jedi, meaning he arrived already having formed attachments, memories, and a mother he loved and was forced to leave behind as a slave. A departure the Jedi Council permitted with real reservations about whether a child that old, carrying that much unresolved history, could ever fully absorb the Order's central teaching about releasing attachment. Qui-Gon Jinn insisted on training him anyway, over the Council's explicit doubts, framing Anakin's unprecedented midi-chlorian count and the prophecy of a chosen one who would bring balance to the Force as reasons the normal rules should bend. The entire arc of Anakin's Jedi training, in other words, began as an exception. The Order was uneasy about making granted by a mentor who died before he could see it through, leaving a 9-year-old prodigy to be raised the rest of the way by an Order that had voted, in effect reluctantly, to take him in. The specific detail worth sitting with. Anakin's fall was not sudden. It was engineered patiently across years by Palpatine, who understood exactly which fears to amplify and exactly when to amplify them. Anakin did not wake up one day and decide to become evil. He was maneuvered, one manufactured crisis at a time, into a position where turning to the dark side felt, to him in the moment, like the only way to save the person he loved most. Palpatine's cultivation of Anakin across the years leading up to Revenge of the Sith deserves a fuller accounting, because it is arguably the single most patient individual manipulation on this entire list. According to material covering the years between The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine positioned himself as a mentor figure and confidant well before Anakin was ever formally knighted, cultivating a friendship that gave him access to Anakin's private doubts and grievances in a way no Jedi Master, bound by the Order's own emotional distance, ever managed to replicate. He listened, without judgment, to complaints about Council restrictions Anakin found suffocating. He validated frustrations about being passed over for the rank of Jedi Master despite his battlefield accomplishments. He planted, gradually and deniably, the specific seed that would matter most, stories and legends about Sith power capable of preventing death, delivered years before Anakin ever had a personal reason to care about that specific promise, so that by the time Anakin's prophetic dreams of Padme's death began, the idea that such power existed and that Palpatine might know how to access it was already, quietly, established in his mind. What happened next is well known, but the tactical details matter for understanding Vader's actual power level rather than his emotional arc. Within hours of his fall, Anakin, now Darth Vader, led the 501st Legion in the execution of the Jedi Temple's younglings and instructors, an act so severe that it immediately and permanently separated him from any path back to who he had been. He then personally led the massacre of the Separatist Council on Mustafar, cutting down the very leaders whose war he had spent 3 years fighting on the Republic's behalf, on Palpatine's direct order, without hesitation. His duel against Obi-Wan Kenobi on Mustafar itself is frequently cited as one of the most technically skilled and emotionally devastating lightsaber confrontations in the franchise's history. Two men who had fought side by side for years, now trying to kill each other on a planet actively erupting with lava around them. Vader lost that duel, badly, losing 3 limbs and suffering catastrophic burns that required him to be rebuilt inside life-sustaining armor for the rest of his life. This is the detail that separates Vader's placement from Revan's. Unlike Revan, whose power survived total memory erasure intact, Vader's power was permanently, physically diminished by his fall. The armor that made him iconic was also a life support system compensating for a body that had been all but destroyed. The construction of that armor and its purpose deserve a moment of dedicated attention, because it's easy to treat it purely as visual iconography, rather than the medical necessity it actually represents within the story. According to material detailing the character's reconstruction on Mustafar and afterward, Vader's suit functions as a continuous whole-body life support system, regulating everything from respiration to temperature for a body that could not otherwise survive outside it. Every appearance of Vader across the original trilogy, every force choke, every duel, is performed by a being operating under a permanent, mechanically enforced physical limitation that none of the other Sith Lords on this list carry, a detail that makes his continued status as one of the galaxy's most feared enforcers for 2 decades even more remarkable, since he achieved it while operating at a fraction of his own prior physical capacity. And yet, diminished as he was, Vader spent the next 2 decades as the Empire's most feared enforcer, a role that required real, continuous demonstration of force power and lightsaber skill against genuine threats. He hunted surviving Jedi across the galaxy during the era referenced across multiple stories covering the Empire's early years, personally responsible for ending the lives of Jedi who had survived Order 66's initial purge. He commanded fleets. He force-choked officers who failed him without a second thought, a detail so consistently repeated across the original trilogy that it became one of the character's defining traits: absolute casual authority over life and death within his own chain of command. His confrontation with Luke Skywalker on Cloud City, chronicled in The Empire Strikes Back, remains the clearest demonstration of the gap between Vader and an untrained but gifted opponent. Luke, despite brief training under Yoda, was outmatched at essentially every stage of that duel, losing a hand and nearly his life before Vader's actual goal became clear: not to kill his son, but to turn him, offering him a place at his side, ruling the galaxy together. That offer, more than any single strike in the fight, is what defines Vader's remaining humanity. Even fully committed to the dark side, some part of him still wanted his son beside him rather than dead. The years between that Cloud City duel and Vader's final choice on the second Death Star are worth a brief note, because they show a man visibly, if quietly, wrestling with the discovery that his son was alive. According to material covering that period, Vader's pursuit of Luke across the following year was never as single-mindedly hostile as his pursuit of ordinary rebel targets. A hesitation, a curiosity, a refusal to simply report Luke's existence and location to Palpatine immediately, all of which reads, in hindsight, as the first cracks in 20 years of otherwise total obedience. The final trial is the one that defines his entire legacy, and it happens in the last minutes of Return of the Jedi. Watching the Emperor torture his son with Force lightning, Vader, after 20 years of unbroken service to Sidious, after a Death Star's worth of atrocities committed in his name, makes a single choice that undoes everything Palpatine spent decades building. He picks up his master and throws him down a reactor shaft, sacrificing his own life in the process, dying not as Darth Vader but, according to his final words, as Anakin Skywalker again. It was not raw power alone that made Vader significant, and by the numbers alone, several Sith Lords on this list could plausibly match or exceed him in a straight, uncomplicated duel. It was the fact that 20 years of the galaxy's most complete indoctrination, years of careful manipulation by the single most patient Sith strategist in the Order's history, still wasn't enough to fully extinguish who Anakin Skywalker was underneath the armour. Every Sith Lord ranked below him on this list who fell to the dark side fell and stayed fallen. Vader is the only one who fell, ruled for 2 decades as one of the most feared beings in the galaxy, and then chose his way back out. But the man who built that 20-year trap, who selected Anakin as a child specifically because he recognised an unmatched well of potential, and who was patient enough to wait over a decade for that potential to fully mature into obedience, was already, by that point in his life, no longer the most dangerous Sith his own bloodline of teachers had produced. That distinction belonged to a man whose name Palpatine himself was never permitted to speak in public, because acknowledging his existence would have meant admitting he was not in fact the most gifted Sith Lord in 2,000 years. He was only the second most gifted. He simply made sure he was the only one left standing. 10 Sith Lords down, 5 left to go, and the gap between where we are and where we're headed is not a small one. Everything ranked so far has, in some sense, operated on a scale a single planet, a single fleet, a single duel could measure. Darth Talon's skill could be clocked against a single opponent's reflexes. Naga Sado's empire could be measured in star systems conquered. Even Vader, arguably the most iconic name on this entire list, is ultimately a story about one man's internal war, decided in the final minutes of one single confrontation. The next 5 names operate on a different scale entirely. One of them will manipulate an entire galactic economy without the galaxy ever noticing there was a manipulator. One of them will rule 2 governments simultaneously in public for over a decade and never get caught by anyone whose job it was to catch him. And one of them, the answer to the question this whole ranking has been building toward, will stop being containable by the word Sith Lord at all, because he found a way to make death itself optional. We are not ranking warriors anymore, we are ranking scale. Number 3. Darth Plagueis. A moon banker sits on the board of the intergalactic banking clan, quietly steering trillions of credits through galactic markets, and not one financial regulator, not one Jedi, not one rival Sith Lord ever manages to prove he is the single most powerful dark side practitioner alive. He does not need an army. He owns the people who own the armies. Darth Plagueis' origin, detailed across James Luceno's novel, Star Wars, Darth Plagueis, is unusual among Sith Lords, in that his defining wound was never a battlefield defeat or a public humiliation. It was mortality itself. According to the novel, Plagueis, born Higo Damask among the Moon, a species already known throughout the galaxy for financial genius, became obsessed from a young age with the idea that death was not a law of nature, but an engineering problem the Sith Order simply hadn't solved yet, largely because every Sith Lord before him had been too consumed by war and conquest to devote serious study to the question. The Moon cultural background here matters more than it might first appear. According to the novel, the Moon as a species had, for generations before Plagueis' birth, built their entire civilization's reputation around financial acumen and long-term planning, dominating galactic banking through the intergalactic banking clan precisely because Moon culture prized patient, generational strategy over short-term gain. Plagueis was, in that sense, a product of exactly the right culture at exactly the right time. A species that already thought in decades and centuries rather than years, whose cultural instincts toward patient accumulation of leverage mapped almost perfectly onto the kind of multi-generational Sith scheming the rule of 2 demanded, once he turned those same instincts toward darker ends. This is the detail that separates Plagueis from every Sith Lord ranked below him. He did not fall to the dark side out of anger, grief, or ambition for territory. He fell toward a research question. Power, to Plagueis, was never the goal. It was the necessary funding mechanism for an experiment that would take decades to complete. Plagueis' rise inside the Sith Order itself followed the rule of 2 exactly as Bane designed it, training under his own master, Darth Tenebrous, before killing him and assuming the mantle of Dark Lord. But where nearly every other Sith master on this list spent their reign consolidating military or political power, Plagueis spent his consolidating something rarer, total invisible control over the galactic economy. According to the novel, he maneuvered himself into a controlling position within the intergalactic banking clan, one of the wealthiest and most influential financial institutions in the galaxy. using the moon species' cultural talent for finance as perfect cover. A Sith Lord hiding inside a banker was, by design, the single hardest kind of Sith Lord for the Jedi Order to ever think to look for. His relationship with his own master, Darth Tenebrous, deserves a brief note, because it establishes a pattern that recurs throughout Plagueis' own later mentorship of Palpatine. According to the novel, Tenebrous himself was deeply invested in questions of Sith alchemy and the manipulation of life at a cellular level, meaning Plagueis' own eventual obsession with cheating death was not invented from nothing. It was, in part, an inheritance from his own master's research, one Plagueis ultimately surpassed and then terminated by killing Tenebrous, once his own understanding exceeded what his teacher had left to offer him. That same pattern, a student who absorbs everything useful from a master's research before ending the master's usefulness entirely, is exactly what Palpatine would later do to Plagueis himself, a symmetry the novel makes explicit. The specific tactical detail worth sitting with: Plagueis' power over galactic markets gave him leverage no lightsaber-focused Sith Lord on this list ever possessed. He could destabilize a planet's economy, fund both sides of a coming war, or quietly bankrupt a rival faction without ever drawing a weapon, or revealing his identity as a Sith Lord at all. When the stage was finally set for the Clone Wars, a conflict that, according to Lucino's novel, Plagueis and his apprentice worked together to engineer over the course of years, the financial infrastructure enabling that war, the very ability of the Trade Federation and the Separatists to field droid armies at scale, ran through channels Plagueis had spent decades quietly securing. His research into cheating death is the detail that makes him relevant not just as a schemer, but as a figure of genuine, singular force mastery. According to the novel, Plagueis achieved something no other Sith Lord ranked below him on this list is confirmed to have replicated: the ability to use the dark side of the Force to influence the midi-chlorians directly, manipulating them to create life and, more importantly to him, to prevent the ones he cared about from dying. He is explicitly stated, through dialogue later delivered by his own apprentice, to have been so powerful and so wise that he could keep the people he cared about from dying entirely, a claim no other figure on this list, aside from the entity at the very top, comes close to matching. And here is the tragedy the entire entry is built around. For all his genius, Plagueis never solved the one problem closest to himself. His apprentice, Darth Sidious, patient, disciplined, and secretly resentful of playing second to a master who treated him as a research subject as much as an heir, killed him in his sleep, according to the novel's climax, ending his research permanently before Plagueis could ever complete or safely transfer the knowledge that might have granted himself the deathlessness he sought for others. The single greatest expert in the galaxy on cheating death died the same way anyone else does, by trusting the wrong person to keep watch while he was vulnerable. It's worth dwelling on exactly how Plagueis' economic warfare functioned, because it is the aspect of his career least understood by audiences who only know him through Sidious's brief description of him in Revenge of the Sith. According to the novel, Plagueis did not simply sit on the intergalactic banking clan's board collecting influence passively. He actively cultivated relationships with Trade Federation leadership, including Newt Gunray, using the banking clan's financial leverage to steer Federation policy toward positions that would eventually make the Federation useful as an unwitting engine of galactic destabilization. He funded shipping conglomerates. He manipulated currency valuations across multiple sectors simultaneously. He understood, decades before anyone else in the galaxy's financial establishment, that economic pressure could accomplish what armies took generations to achieve, and could do it while remaining completely invisible to the institutions built to detect exactly that kind of manipulation. The specific number worth anchoring here: by the time the Clone Wars actually began, the droid armies fielded by the Separatist movement numbered in the trillions of units, an industrial output only possible because the financial and manufacturing infrastructure behind it had been quietly secured years, in some cases over a decade, before a single shot was fired. That infrastructure was Plagueis' signature achievement, executed so cleanly that even the Jedi Order's own intelligence-gathering apparatus never traced the Separatist crisis back to a single moon banker sitting quietly on a financial committee. His personal mastery of the dark side, separate entirely from his political and economic maneuvering, is worth its own accounting. According to the novel, Plagueis' understanding of Sith alchemy and life creation extended to direct experimentation on both plant and animal test subjects long before he ever attempted anything resembling the midi-chlorian manipulation, later referenced by Sidious. He is described as having successfully extended the lifespans of test subjects, and, in at least one documented instance in the novel, resurrected a creature that had been definitively dead, a feat that positions him, on pure demonstrated dark side capability, above every single Sith Lord ranked below him on this list, with the arguable exception of Vitiate himself. The difference between Plagueis and Vitiate is not raw capability. It is time. Vitiate had centuries to perfect what Plagueis was only decades into solving, when his own apprentice cut that research short. It was not the dark side of the Force alone that made Plagueis dangerous. It was the decision to treat Sith power as a scientific and financial problem rather than a military one, a decision that let him quietly control the fate of the entire galaxy's economy for decades without ever needing to fight a single documented duel on this list. Every Sith Lord ranked above him inherited something from that decision, whether they admit it or not. The understanding that the deepest kind of power is the kind nobody else knows to look for. But the apprentice who killed him in his sleep did not do it out of simple ambition. He did it because he had already surpassed his master's caution in the one area that mattered most, patience, and because he understood something Plagueis never fully accepted. Knowledge without total control over who else possesses it is not power. It's a liability waiting to happen to you exactly the way it happened to Plagueis. The next entry on this list spent that lesson wisely enough to rule two governments simultaneously, in plain sight, for over a decade, without a single soul in either government ever putting the pieces together in time to stop him. Number 2. Darth Sidious. A junior senator from Naboo rises to become Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic through what looks, to every historian and political analyst in the galaxy, like a remarkable but entirely legitimate career. 12 years later, that same man declares himself Emperor, and by then it is far too late for anyone to ask how a mid-tier senator quietly became the most powerful individual in galactic history without a single Jedi noticing what he actually was. Sidious's origin, expanded across Lucino's Darth Plagueis and referenced throughout the prequel trilogy, begins with Sheev Palpatine's discovery and training by Plagueis, a mentorship the novel frames less as nurturing and more as calculated cultivation. Plagueis recognized in the young Palpatine a rare capacity for patience and deception that exceeded his own, and trained him specifically because that capacity was useful, not because Plagueis felt any particular warmth toward him. Palpatine's defining wound, if the formula demands one, is the specific resentment of always being treated as a means to Plagueis' research ends, rather than a partner in his own right. That resentment produced the single most disciplined Sith Lord this list has covered. Where Plagueis wanted to conquer death itself, Sidious wanted something narrower and in the end more achievable: total undetected control over every major institution in galactic civilization simultaneously. It's worth pausing on the specific years of Palpatine's apprenticeship under Plagueis, since the novel treats them as a formative crucible rather than a simple training montage. According to Darth Plagueis, the young Palpatine was taught not only Sith combat and Force techniques, but an entire philosophy of patience that ran directly counter to the impatience that had doomed most previous Sith apprentices to premature exposure or premature betrayal. Plagueis drilled into him the idea that the greatest Sith Lord in history would not be remembered for a single spectacular act of power, but for an accumulation of small, undetectable moves sustained over a timescale no one watching for danger would think to measure against. Palpatine absorbed that lesson so completely that he eventually turned it against the very master who taught it to him, killing Plagueis not in a moment of rage, but at the single most patient, calculated moment available, once his master's usefulness had been fully extracted. The scale of Sidious's deception is almost impossible to overstate, and it is worth walking through in specific stages, because no other Sith Lord on this list ran a con this large for this long. As Palpatine, he was Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, presiding over the Senate, commanding the Grand Army of the Republic once the Clone Wars began, and serving as the public face of the galaxy's fight against the separatist threat. As Darth Sidious, he was simultaneously the secret master behind that same separatist movement, directing Count Dooku, financing the droid armies the Republic's own clone troopers were dying to defeat, and orchestrating both sides of a war that killed millions, specifically so that its resolution would leave him with unchecked emergency powers over the entire galaxy. According to material detailing the war's engineering, Sidious did not merely tolerate the Clone Wars bloodshed as an acceptable cost, he required it. A galaxy exhausted by war, terrified of chaos, and grateful for any authority willing to promise stability was, by his own calculation, a galaxy that would hand over its democratic institutions willingly, rather than have them seized. Order 66, the simultaneous galaxy-wide execution of the Jedi Order by clone troopers acting on secretly embedded orders, stands as the single most devastating act of institutional betrayal in the franchise's history, and it required over a decade of patient infrastructure building to make possible. The clone army's creation on Kamino, the inhibitor chips embedded in every clone trooper's mind, the political maneuvering that placed those troopers under his direct command as Chancellor. The Kamino cloning operation alone deserves fuller treatment, because it demonstrates the sheer administrative depth of Sidious's planning years before Attack of the Clones even begins. According to material detailing the army's origins, the order for the clone army was placed under Sidious's manipulation roughly a decade before the Clone Wars actually started, meaning Sidious was already engineering the Republic's future military and the secret mechanism for its eventual betrayal of the Jedi before Naboo had even been invaded, before Anakin Skywalker had even been found on Tatooine. That timeline alone should recalibrate how audiences understand the scope of his planning. The entire prequel trilogy's plot, from the Trade Federation blockade forward, unfolds inside a scheme whose logistical foundation was already years old by the time the story even begins. His duel with Mace Windu, one of the only Jedi Masters skilled enough to nearly end his reign in a single confrontation, is the clearest demonstration of Sidious's raw combat capability on this list. Cornered in his own office, unmasked as a Sith Lord in front of one of the Jedi Order's most dangerous duelists, Sidious still very nearly won that fight on lightsaber skill alone before resorting to Force lightning, a power he wielded with a level of raw destructive force that, according to the scene's own framing, visibly disfigured his own face from the strain of channeling it at that intensity. Anakin's intervention, not any weakness on Sidious's part, is what ultimately decided that confrontation, and Sidious exploited that intervention instantly and completely, turning the single moment of vulnerability into the final push that secured Anakin's fall to the dark side. For the next 2 decades as Emperor, Sidious ruled the galaxy openly as its most powerful political and military authority, while continuing to operate with the same layered deception that defined his rise. According to material covering the Empire's internal structure, he maintained rival power centers deliberately: Vader, Grand Moffs, Imperial Intelligence, various shadow projects like the Death Star program, specifically to ensure no single subordinate ever accumulated enough independent authority to challenge him, applying the same principle of controlled instability among his lieutenants that he had once applied to entire governments. Even Vader, his most trusted enforcer for 20 years, was never told the full truth of Sidious's plans regarding Luke Skywalker until it served Sidious's purposes to reveal them. The specific structure of that deliberate instability is worth spelling out, because it explains how Sidious sustained absolute personal control across an empire spanning millions of worlds without ever fully trusting a single subordinate with the complete picture. According to material covering the Imperial hierarchy, Sidious cultivated redundant, overlapping chains of command and intelligence, gathering apparatuses that reported independently to him, ensuring that any single Grand Moff, Admiral, or even Vader himself possessed only a partial view of the Empire's total military and political apparatus. No one beneath Sidious, not even his most trusted enforcer, ever had enough visibility into the whole system to plan a coordinated challenge to his authority, because no one beneath Sidious was ever permitted to see the whole system at all. Consider the sheer administrative discipline required to sustain the Chancellor deception for over a decade without a single significant leak. According to material detailing his rise, Palpatine cultivated relationships across the entire Senate, Padme Amidala's trust, Bail Organa's cautious respect, even, for a time, sympathetic hearing from Jedi Council members like Mace Windu, who suspected something was wrong but could never prove it. He weathered assassination attempts, votes of no confidence, and the natural scrutiny that comes with holding the Republic's highest office during its most turbulent era, and not once, across that entire span, did his composure crack in a way that gave the game away. Compare that to Dooku, whose usefulness to Sidious lasted exactly as long as it took Anakin Skywalker to become a more valuable asset. Sidious never had that kind of single point of failure in his own conduct, because he never let a single relationship, a single institution, or a single piece of leverage become load-bearing enough that losing it would expose him. The specific number worth anchoring here, because it is the detail that makes his deception almost impossible to fully process: 12 years. That is roughly how long Palpatine held the office of Supreme Chancellor, while simultaneously operating as Darth Sidious, secretly orchestrating the very separatist crisis his own Republic government was mobilizing to fight. 12 years of daily Senate sessions, military briefings, diplomatic negotiations, and personal mentorship of the literal prophesied chosen one of the Jedi Order, conducted without a single verified leak, until the moment he chose personally and deliberately to let Mace Windu discover the truth in his own office. Because by that point the reveal itself had become useful rather than dangerous to him. He did not get caught. He decided the con was finished and ended it on his own terms. It was not raw force power alone that made Sidious the second most dangerous being on this entire list, though by any measure his command of the dark side was extraordinary. It was the fact that he ran the single longest, most complete deception in galactic history, controlling both sides of a war, both major galactic governments and his own apprentice's fate for over a decade, without a single Jedi Master, a single Senator, or a single ally ever fully understanding what he actually was until the moment he chose to reveal it himself. Every Sith Lord ranked below him wanted power. Sidious wanted the entire galaxy to hand it to him willingly, and very nearly got exactly that. But even Sidious, for all his patience and all his power, eventually died, thrown down a reactor shaft by the very apprentice he spent 20 years shaping into a weapon, and later, according to material covering his return, forced to cheat death itself through dark rituals and cloning technology that even he could only barely sustain. There is one being in this entire 2,000-year history who did not need rituals to cheat death, who did not need a body at all in the conventional sense, because he had already solved the problem Plagueis spent his life chasing, solved it so completely that Sith Lord stopped being an adequate description for what he became centuries before Sidious ever took the name. Number 1. Darth Vitiate / Valkorion, Godlike. An emperor rules a Sith empire for over 1,000 years, not a dynasty, not a bloodline, the same individual the entire time. Somewhere around the 700-year mark, historians studying the empire's records stopped trying to explain how that was possible and started simply accepting it as one of the fixed, terrifying facts of galactic history. Darth Vitiate's origin, established across Star Wars, the Old Republic and its accompanying material, begins nearly 300 years after Naga Sado's Great Hyperspace War, in the aftermath of the ancient Sith Empire's collapse into the wilds of the galaxy's fringes. Born to a mother who was herself deeply versed in Sith sorcery, Vitiate's birth was, according to the game's lore, accompanied by ritual sacrifice and dark side manipulation, before he had even drawn his first breath, his own mother attempting to harness his birth as a source of power, only for the infant Vitiate to reverse the ritual and consume her life force instead. He killed his own mother before he could walk. This is the wound the formula demands, except inverted. Where every other Sith Lord on this list suffered a loss that shaped them, Vitiate's origin is a demonstration that loss simply did not apply to him the way it applied to anyone else. He did not survive tragedy. He generated it from his very first moments of existence and walked away from it unmarked. The specific circumstances surrounding the Sith Empire's collapse in the wake of Sado's Great Hyperspace War are worth understanding as the backdrop against which Vitiate's rise becomes possible. According to the Old Republic's lore, following Sado's failed invasion and the resulting Republic crackdown on the Sith presence in known space, the remnants of the ancient Sith Empire scattered into the unknown regions, fracturing into isolated, feuding factions no longer bound by any single central authority, a diaspora spanning generations, with different Sith bloodlines pursuing survival through wildly different means, some through outright barbarism, others through careful, patient consolidation of whatever scraps of territory and resources they could secure. Vitiate was born into this scattered, leaderless diaspora, which means his eventual unification of it into a single, centrally controlled empire represents an achievement of political consolidation on a scale that dwarfs even what Marka Ragnos or Naga Sadow accomplished with a Sith civilization that, in their eras, had at least still been geographically concentrated on Korriban. Vitiate's rise to power followed a specific and terrifying logic that no other Sith Lord on this list replicates at scale. He did not merely seek strength, he sought permanence. According to the Old Republic's lore, he unified the scattered remnants of the ancient Sith into a new hidden empire on the planet Dromund Kaas, ruling as Emperor for centuries, while his public face remained carefully obscured even from most of his own subjects. An entire Sith empire built and sustained under a leader whose true nature was known only to his innermost circle. Dromund Kaas itself deserves a moment's attention as more than a simple capital world. According to the game's lore, Vitiate selected the planet specifically for its natural saturation in dark side energy, a world whose very environment amplified Sith sorcery, allowing him to construct a capital and a Sith academy whose infrastructure was, in a very real sense, built to compound its own power over time rather than simply house a government. Unlike Korriban, whose association with the ancient Sith Empire made it a known, findable target for outside enemies, Dromund Kaas was concealed deep enough within the unknown regions that the Republic had no accurate knowledge of the Sith Empire's continued existence for centuries, an isolation Vitiate cultivated deliberately, understanding that a threat the galaxy doesn't know exists cannot be prepared for. The specific tactical and civilizational detail worth sitting with. Vitiate's Sith Empire eventually grew powerful enough to launch a full-scale invasion of the Republic, a war chronicled extensively across the Old Republic's narrative, in which his forces sacked Coruscant itself, a feat that neither Naga Sadow's ancient empire nor Exar Kun's rebellion, nor Revan's own Sith Empire had ever fully accomplished. That invasion was not simply a military campaign. According to the game's lore, Vitiate's true objective in orchestrating a war that killed billions was to generate a planet-scale source of death and suffering he could then consume directly through Sith ritual, intending to drain the entire population of Coruscant to fuel his own transcendence beyond the need for a physical body at all. His actual method of extending his life is the detail that separates him from every single other entry on this list, including Plagueis. Where Plagueis researched theoretical methods of preventing death through midi-chlorian manipulation and never lived to complete that research, Vitiate achieved something categorically different and already fully operational centuries earlier: the ability to transfer his consciousness into new hosts entirely, discarding failing or inconvenient bodies and continuing his existence uninterrupted. According to the game's narrative, he did this repeatedly across his reign, at one point even fracturing his own spirit into multiple bodies simultaneously, effectively existing as more than one person at once during periods when it served his strategic purposes. It's worth pausing specifically on that fracturing ability because it is arguably the single most conceptually unprecedented power documented anywhere on this list. According to material covering this period of his reign, Vitiate did not simply possess a backup plan in case any one body died. He was, for stretches of his rule, genuinely operating as multiple simultaneous instances of himself, each capable of independent thought and action, coordinated toward shared goals in a way that made conventional notions of assassination or capture functionally meaningless. Killing Vitiate during these periods did not mean killing Vitiate. It meant removing one working copy of an entity that had already, by design, ensured its own continuation elsewhere. This is worth pausing on directly, because it is the single clearest demonstration on this entire list of why the word Godlike belongs in this ranking's title at all. Talon, Maul, even Vader. Every one of them existed as a single continuous body, vulnerable to a single killing blow. Vitiate existed as a pattern that bodies were merely temporary containers for, meaning that killing any individual body wearing his identity was never actually equivalent to killing him. Centuries into his reign, a coalition of Jedi and Sith alike, recognizing the scale of the threat he represented, managed to seemingly destroy him during the war for Coruscant, an event that the wider galaxy would spend years afterward believing had actually ended his threat for good. It had not. According to material covering the game's later expansions, Vitiate's spirit survived the apparent destruction of his physical body and quietly, patiently, spent decades embedding himself within the ancient world of Zakuul, eventually manifesting as Emperor Valkorion, founder of the Eternal Empire, a new galactic power that would go on to conquer both the Republic and the reconstituted Sith Empire simultaneously, ruling openly as a benevolent-seeming emperor for decades, while his true identity as Vitiate remained hidden even from his own children. The Eternal Empire and the Valkorion identity deserve a fuller accounting on their own terms, because the scale of that particular deception even exceeds what Sidious managed as Palpatine. According to the Knights of the Fallen Empire material, Valkorion did not simply rule Zakuul in secret the way Vitiate had once ruled Dromund Kaas from the shadows. He ruled openly, publicly, beloved by his citizens as a wise and benevolent founder-emperor, fathering children, Arkan and Vaylin among them, who grew up believing him to be exactly what he appeared to be, with no knowledge whatsoever of the atrocities committed centuries earlier under his true identity. He built an entire multi-generational royal dynasty as camouflage, a depth of long-term identity construction that makes even Sidious's 12 years as Chancellor look, by comparison, almost improvised. The specific detail that closes this entry and this entire ranking out, even after being defeated again as Valkorion, his consciousness did not simply vanish. According to the game's ongoing narrative through its Knights of the Fallen Empire and Knights of the Eternal Throne expansions, his spirit attempted to possess his own son, Arkan, and later the player character themselves, continuing to seek a new host centuries after his supposed final death, refusing, across literally 1,000 years of galactic history and multiple confirmed deaths, to accept that his story was ever actually over. The attempted possession of his own children is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it reveals something about Vitiate that separates him even from the other purely power-obsessed figures on this list. He did not simply view Arkan and Vaylin as heirs in any conventional dynastic sense. According to the Fallen Empire material, both children were, from birth, potential vessels, backup bodies cultivated specifically for the possibility that Valkorion's current form might eventually need replacing, their own individual identities and ambitions treated by their father as ultimately subordinate to his own continuation. That is not parenthood in any recognizable sense. It is inventory management conducted across decades, using his own bloodline as raw material the same way Plagueis once used test subjects. It's worth detailing exactly what centuries of uninterrupted rule allowed Vitiate to build, because scale is the entire point of his placement at the top of this list. According to the Old Republic's lore, his Sith Empire on Dromund Kaas developed technology, sorcery and military doctrine continuously refined across generations of subordinate Sith Lords, all of it directed by the same unbroken central authority. No succession crises, no rule of two power vacuums, no risk of an ambitious apprentice derailing centuries of accumulated planning, because Vitiate was simultaneously the master and in practice his own eventual successor. Every other Sith Empire covered on this list, from Nagasado's fractured magisters to Sidious's 20-year empire, existed within the span of ordinary mortal ambition and mortal succession. Vitiate's empire had none of those natural failure points, because the person at the top of it never actually changed. The invasion of Coruscant deserves one more specific detail, because it demonstrates the terrifying practicality underneath Vitiate's cosmic ambitions. He did not simply want to conquer the Republic's capital for territorial gain. According to the game's narrative, the entire war was, from his perspective, an elaborate ritual delivery mechanism. Billions of deaths across a sustained, brutal siege, generating exactly the kind of concentrated suffering Sith sorcery could convert into raw power for the specific ritual he intended to perform once the city had suffered enough. Every other war on this list, from the Great Hyperspace War to the Clone Wars, was fought for territory, resources, or ideology. Vitiate's war for Coruscant was fought as fuel. The Republic's capital was never the prize, it was the sacrifice. And even that was not his final form. The transition from Vitiate to Emperor Valkorion of the Eternal Empire represents something no other entry on this list attempts even once. Total reinvention, not just of a body, but of an entire public identity and political project, sustained across further decades, ruling as a wise, war-ending emperor beloved by billions of Zakuulan citizens who had no idea their benevolent founder was the same entity responsible for the sack of Coruscant centuries earlier. He built an entire mythology around Valkorion specifically to make the eventual unveiling of his true nature, when it finally came, as devastating as possible to everyone who had trusted him, a manipulation operating on a timescale and a scale of victims that dwarfs even Sidious's 12-year Chancellor deception by well over 100 years. It was not conquest, and it was not raw force power in a single duel that separates Darth Vitiate from every other name on this list, though by every measure available, both of those things were also true of him at a scale nothing else here matches. It was the fact that he solved the one problem every other Sith Lord on this list either failed to solve or died trying to solve. He made his own continued existence independent of any single body, any single identity, any single defeat. Talon can be beaten in a duel. Vader can be redeemed. Sidious can be thrown down a reactor shaft. Vitiate can be defeated as many times as the galaxy is capable of defeating him, and it will not matter, because Vitiate was never really the name of a person to begin with. It was the name of a pattern that had already stopped needing a body 1,000 years before most of the Sith Lords on this list were even born. Every Sith Lord on this list was underestimated for the exact quality that later made them dangerous. Talon's lack of ambition made her loyal. Maul's discarded status made him unpredictable. Dooku's political brilliance made him disposable in exactly the way he never saw coming. Vader's humanity, buried under 20 years of armor, made him the one Sith Lord capable of undoing his own master's entire plan in the final seconds. And Vitiate's willingness to treat his own body as disposable, the one thing every other Sith Lord on this list, godlike ambitions and all, still instinctively clung to, is exactly what let him outlast all of them, outlast entire empires, and very possibly outlast the galaxy itself. Honourable mentions. 15 names is not enough to cover 2,000 years of Sith history, and 3 figures in particular deserve a place in this conversation, even though none of them quite fit cleanly into the main ranking. Darth Krayt, founder of the One Sith and the man Darth Talon served with total loyalty, deserves recognition for what he built rather than what he personally overpowered. A former Jedi Knight named Asharad Het, who survived Order 66's aftermath and drifted through a horrifying series of transformations. Infection by a Yuuzhan Vong-derived symbiote that granted him regenerative power at the cost of his humanity. According to the Star Wars Legacy comic series, Krayt spent decades in the shadows assembling a new Sith Order patient, enough to wait a full century after the fall of Sidious's empire before making its move. His actual combat power, augmented by that Vong grafting, is formidable enough that he plausibly beats several names in the middle of this list in a straight fight. He falls outside the main 15 because his empire, unlike Vitiate's, Sidious's, or even Naga Sado's, ultimately fractured and collapsed within his own lifetime, undone by the very apprentices he modelled on Bane's Rule of Two philosophy, without ever fully replicating Bane's discipline in applying it. Krayt's journey from Asharad Het to Darth Krayt is worth a bit more unpacking, because it is one of the strangest transformation arcs in the wider Star Wars canon. According to the Legacy series, Het survived the fall of the Jedi Order as a wandering Tusken-raised Jedi, drifting through the galaxy's underworld for decades in relative obscurity, before his fateful exposure to Yuuzhan Vong biotechnology, during a period of scavenging and desperation. That exposure did not simply grant him power. It began a slow, ongoing physical transformation that stripped away recognizable humanity in exchange for regenerative capability so extreme that conventional lethal wounds simply failed to end him. A Sith Lord whose greatest weapon was, in effect, becoming steadily less human and more monster with each passing year of his reign, right up until the moment his own body's transformation began outpacing even his own control over it. Darth Caedus, formerly the Jedi Knight Jacen Solo, son of Han Solo and Leia Organa, nephew to Luke Skywalker, represents one of the more tragic entries any ranking of this kind has to consider. According to the Legacy of the Force novel series, Jacen's fall came not from a single dramatic betrayal, but from a slow, self-justified slide into believing that ruling the galaxy through fear was the only way to prevent a foreseen greater catastrophe, ultimately leading him to kill his own aunt, Mara Jade Skywalker, and wage war against much of his own family. His power, drawing on training from multiple traditions including Sith teachings, passed down through Vergera and Lumiere, was genuinely formidable. He's excluded from the main 15, Largely because his reign was brief, his empire was really just a faction within an already fractured post-Empire galaxy, and his story functions more as a cautionary echo of Vader's arc than as a new template, the son repeating a version of the father's fall, without ever building anything that outlasted him the way Vitiate's or Sidious's projects did. The specific chain of influence that led Jacen to his fall is worth a bit more detail, since it distinguishes him from a simple copy-paste of his grandfather's arc. According to the Legacy of the Force novels, his path began with training under Vader, a mysterious former Jedi held captive by the Yuuzhan Vong during the war against that invading species, training that exposed him to a radically unconventional understanding of the Force, one that treated the traditional light side versus dark side framework as itself a limiting illusion. That philosophical seed, planted years before his formal fall, was later cultivated more deliberately by Lumia, a former Sith apprentice of the Second Emperor Palpatine clone era, who recognized in Jacen's post-Vader worldview exactly the kind of malleable, self-justifying framework a patient manipulator could bend toward. Genuinely Sith ends without Jacen ever fully recognizing the destination he was being steered toward. Darth Neal, another of Crate's lieutenants and a master of the archaic Sith blade tradition, rather than lightsaber combat, deserves a mention purely for novelty. He is one of the only Sith Lords across this entire 2,000-year survey who deliberately rejected the lightsaber as his primary weapon, arguing that dependence on a single elegant tool made a warrior predictable. His personal combat philosophy echoes Talon's physical mastery approach at the bottom of this list, which is a reminder that even at the furthest ends of Sith history, some lessons get rediscovered generation after generation rather than invented fresh each time. None of these three change the shape of the top 5, but all three prove the same point this entire ranking has been building toward. The Sith Order's 2,000-year survival was never really about any single bloodline or any single training tradition. It was about a philosophy, turn what looks like weakness into the exact tool nobody expects, that kept getting reinvented by people who had never even heard of the Sith Lords who invented it first. 2,000 years of Sith history, and the pattern never changes. Every single name on this list, from the least dangerous to the most, was dismissed at some point by someone who should have known better. A Jedi Council that called a discarded apprentice a distraction at best. A Sith Master who saw his own apprentice as a research subject instead of a threat. A galaxy that spent 1,000 years believing an emperor was finally actually dead. The thesis was never really about ranking who could win a duel. It was about proving that the Sith Order's entire 2,000-year survival was built on a single repeated mistake, made by everyone who ever crossed one of them, assuming the thing that made a Sith Lord look weak, small or beatable was the whole truth about them, instead of exactly the place where their real power was hiding. 15 Sith Lords, one list, and at the very top something that was never really answerable to the word Lord at all, because a Lord can be overthrown, and what Vitiate became, by the time this list finally runs out of names to rank, had already stopped being something a single victory could end. Victory. Next time, we go back to where all of this started. The very first Sith, the exiled Jedi whose fall 4,000 years before Nagasado set every single one of these dominoes in motion. Watch that origin story next.